I'll go ahead and say hello and welcome. And my name is Aisha Haynes, and I will be the host and moderator for this ADEAL conference session. If possible, please turn your camera on so that presenters can see you. Please make sure that your mic is muted to minimize background noise. If you would like to offer nonverbal feedback, for example, thumbs up, clapping, or a heart, you can use the Zoom reactions. There will be time at the end of the session for question and answer. Please note, by entering this ADEAL session, you acknowledge that you are aware that this session will be recorded and may be posted online with ADEAL content. This session will utilize the Zoom live transcription function, which produces subtitles at the bottom of your screen. Please note that the accuracy of the transcription is contingent upon a variety of factors, including background noise and the clarity and volume of the speaker's voice. So thank you for joining us for Testing the Recipe, Researching Role Play in Online Discussions. Please welcome Laurie Berry and Kristin Kowal.
All right, thanks. Yeah, thank you for that warm welcome and great introduction. And as she mentioned, I'm Laurie Berry, and I'm an instructional designer.
And I'm Kristin Kowal. I'm also an instructional designer. I'm getting our slides up there.
Yeah, and
again, ready to go. Yeah, there we go.
Thanks, and again for joining us this morning or this afternoon. And in our session, we'll provide you with the background of our research and how we got to where we are today, the methods that we used, and the results and takeaways of our research, as well as the recommendations that we have for all online discussions. And then we'll end with an open discussion and time for Q&A.
Okay, so we're just gonna present some of our research today. We also did a white paper, which will pop in the chat afterwards. But before we get to the research that we did on the role play strategy and online discussions, I'm just gonna give a little bit of background about why we did this research, because that's kind of important, is to set that up with the why. So a little background here. This is our presentation from 2018, where we first presented this idea called discussion twists. So the setup of that was that both students and faculty can tire of traditional discussion. So like the read, write, post pattern. So we went with a twist metaphor to explore how to reinvigorate online discussions. So we would always say, add a little zest, like you would with citrus zest. And the idea with that, and our claim with that, was that by trying out a twist, then you would be then inviting critical thinking and student engagement into your online discussions. And so what I mean by a twist, and this is how we presented these, was we'd show a traditional question and say, let's just add that twist. And then on the other side, we would show how easy it is to just change the discussion strategy a little bit. So in this case, it was, we changed just a question to a role play and showed how to do that. So we did that once. And then the following year, we did a part 2 with 3 new strategies. So we presented 8 ideas to twist up discussions. So we're presenting these ideas a lot to faculty and instructional designers. Here we were at a conference, and we were hearing back that people were using these strategies either on Twitter, or they would just contact us like, hey, we've tried your ideas. So Laurie and I we like to dive deep on these things. That kind of brings us to the next chapter in our story. We stepped back and thought about it. We're recommending using these strategies. We're seeing evidence that they're working, we think. Faculty are adopting them for use in our online courses. So why do we test that? So here's our research question. We went into research. Does role play as an online discussion instructional strategy foster critical thinking and student engagement? So what we did here is we picked one of those 8 strategies that we were recommending, and we wanted to put it through the research process. So here we are now today in the test kitchen to test out that research question. So today for the rest of the presentation, we're going to share with you how we tested the discussion to answer that research question, what our findings were. And in this photo, we have a grapefruit because that was the fruit that we picked to represent the role play. So I'm going to hand it over to Laurie now to jump into the research itself.
Yeah, thanks, Kristin, for helping to provide a bit of the background on why we determined the need to perform research on using the role play strategy in online discussions. And we'll take a look at the research methods that we use to help answer that research question. And we obtained data from 17 undergraduate students in a concluded self-paced online human biology course that ran from December 2017 through January 2019. And we analyzed the discussion transcripts and written reflection Word documents that were taken from the course's 2 role play activities. And each role play activity had 2 parts. Part 1 was the initial post to the discussion board, and part 2 was a written reflection that was submitted separately in a Word document. And we used 2 researched models as tools to measure and identify evidence of critical thinking. And before we started our research, we performed a literature review to determine what other researchers had used in their studies on student engagement. And from there, we had identified 2 models that were used in multiple research studies and in different settings. And with that, we recognized that these models were repeatable and easy to use. And the first of the models that we used was the Garrison et al.'s 4-stage model of cognitive presence, which is taken from the Community of Inquiry coding scheme. And we use this model to look for evidence of critical thinking. And the second model that we used was the Gunawardena et al. 5-stage model of online learning. And we used this model because we determined that knowledge construction, part of that stage 3, was a component of critical thinking, and therefore this model could also be used for looking at evidence of critical thinking. And in our research, we found it valuable to have used more than one model so that we were able to identify where possible overlaps occurred, and those overlaps were then able to support and confirm our findings. And I've identified the who and the what we measured, as well as the 2 models that we used as tools. And now let's take a look at the process that we used to conduct our research. And as I mentioned, this was a self-paced course. And because of that, each role play discussion activity contained 2 parts. Part 1 was the initial discussion post, and part 2 was that written reflection. And each of these were analyzed and evaluated separately across each of the 2 models, looking for evidence of critical thinking and student engagement, as indicated within each of the 2 models. And the models were marked independently by both Kristin and I. And rather than coding the individual transcript to look for patterns, we instead marked the models themselves with the proof of if the individual transcript displayed direct evidence of the category or its associated indicator. And after marking the models of each transcript, if our markings show that overall agreement between the 2 of us was less than 73% with the Garrison's model of cognitive presence, or 60% with the Gunawardena's model of online learning, we then reviewed the individual markings and discussed any discrepancies. And then the frequency of markings for each of the categories was then calculated and evaluated to determine the answer to our research question of if role play demonstrates evidence of critical thinking and student engagement when used in the online discussion. And lastly, content from the transcripts was also coded into 3 qualitative categories we determined to be as critical thinking, knowledge construction, and student engagement. And this qualitative data is a collection of keywords and phrases that supported our markings in each of the 2 models. Now that I share the method that we followed, let's take a look at our research findings. And as previously mentioned, in our analysis, we found it valuable to have used more than one model for our research so that we were able to identify where overlaps occurred in our results and to also support and confirm those findings. In the Gunawardena 5-stage model for online learning, we identified stage 3, that construction of knowledge, to be the strongest indicator and measurement of critical thinking in this model. And overall, we found that stage 3 was marked with an average frequency of about 50%. And we found an average frequency of about 3% of transcripts were marked as achieving a stage 4, and just over 1.5 with achieving a stage 5. And previous research back in 2013 done by Dumakin found that little evidence of online discussions having reached all 5 stages. And most often, the discussions just remained in stage 1, that sharing and comparing of information stage. And so based on that research and our findings, our results appear to indicate that the role play discussion strategy encourages students to think critically about the topic and concepts and construct new knowledge and meaning from the materials. And when taking a closer look at the breakdown of the stage 3 results for both part 1 and for part 2, we found that part 2, that written reflection, had a higher frequency of markings at about 75% compared to part 1 with just over 20%. And we speculated, based on what we often found in the review of the transcripts, is that students had a harder time of achieving that stage 3 and higher on their own. But once they were able to see the other roles' perspectives, this process enabled them to broaden their own perspectives, to construct new knowledge, and to think critically about their own perspectives and perhaps even their own biases. In the second model that we used, we examined the results of the Garrison's model of cognitive presence, both holistically by the category and by the individual category indicator. And when we reviewed the transcripts, we noticed that this particular model was more descriptive and specific when it was viewed via the indicators. And because of that, we determined that the 3 indicators within the exploration category of suggestions for consideration, brainstorming, and leaps to conclusion, and all 5 indicators in the integration category of convergence, whether it be for adding on to other group members' ideas, to reference others in previous messages, to converge within a single message, to connect ideas or synthesize, or to create solutions. We found that all 8 of these to be specific areas that indicated evidence of student engagement and critical thinking. And with that, we focused in on these specific indicators on where to find our evidence. And based on these results, we drew the conclusion that part 1, the initial post, scored stronger in the exploration category. And we determined this was because students are just beginning to explore and understand the content from their roles assigned perspective. And our results show in the part 2, the written reflection, that it scored strong in all 5 integration indicators and also in the exploration indicator of leaps to conclusions. And we determined this to be that students showed more evidence of making connections to the content and to each other after encountering more information from the other role play perspectives, and also for taking the time to do a self-reflection on the topic content itself. And we recognize the Garrison model to be more complex than Gunawardena model, and this difference accounts for uncovering these different patterns. But as discussed, we found similar patterns between the 2 models, which strengthens and confirms our findings. And during our review, as I mentioned earlier, we analyzed the content from the individual transcripts to identify keywords and phrases that could be used as qualitative evidence to support our findings. And we then coded our findings into the categories of critical thinking, knowledge construction, and student engagement. And these findings align with our markings to the specific categories or indicators determined by both the Gunawardena and the Garrison models. And a few of the keywords and phrases are on this slide. Some of the phrases like, "it makes me wonder," I hadn't initially thought of. It never occurred to me, or I learned some interesting facts. We found these phrases to be almost sort of words of insight into the student's cognitive processing of the material, and all qualitative indicators of students thinking critically about and engaging with the content, which is a strong evidence to support our research. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Kristin to share our conclusion.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. So Laurie just shared our results with you. And so now we're going to make this more meaningful for you as far as what does this mean? How does this apply to role play as a discussion and beyond, maybe even to all discussions? So first, we're going to look at the role play twist itself and what our conclusion we drew from that data is. So firstly, we found that, yeah, role play does foster critical thinking and student engagement. That was our research question. It doesn't happen all the time. It happens enough to recommend as an instructional strategy, just like we wondered about. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper because there are strengths and weaknesses to how the evidence of critical thinking was expressed. So specifically, we saw really strong evidence of critical thinking in the realms of application to the real world. And that was all post because it was a role play that was situated. So it was really strong there. Synthesis, where students were synthesizing information, that was something like 82.4%, where they were synthesizing, exploring. Students were exploring, they were drawing conclusions based on that exploration, even if it was unsupported, they were going a little deeper than just sharing information. That was at 97.1% drawing conclusions. However, even though those are strengths, there is a weakness to the role play strategy that when we first presented it, we weren't as aware of, and that is the information dump. So this tends to happen with this activity. It tends to happen with a lot of discussions. So we'd be interested to see other instances of this activity done, maybe with a little more prompting in the instructions to push students to go beyond sharing information than we already did. If the point was to push students to those higher levels, active facilitation by the instructor, this was an independent learning course, so it was different than kind of more of a cohort situation, but or some scaffolding in the prompts could do that, could push students a little more. So it all depends on what the time you have and what you want to get out of the activity. This is really interesting. Something we noticed was that an info dump at first might look like it's going to be an amazing post that's going to be just showing evidence of all the things we want to see. But sometimes that was a really well-structured and well-cited information dump. It didn't go beyond sharing info. And sometimes smaller, more to the point discussions had more meaningful connections and insights. So the posts weren't always what they seemed, and that was surprising looking at those. And finally, a big one is to include a reflection if you want to get more into the learner's thought process. That was one of the biggest places we saw evidence of knowledge construction. And here's just kind of an example of what a reflection might look like. Again, that was something like 75.6% knowledge construction level in the reflection component versus 20.6 with the discussion post alone. So without the reflection component, our data would tell a different story. So, and the reflection is like asking them to share their thought process. So it doesn't have to be a part 2, et cetera. Just having some kind of reflection component baked in there. So those were our conclusions on the specific role play activity. And these conclusions, they can be adapted more universally. So Laurie is going to share how what we learned and the insights can benefit all discussions if your goal is to get students to that level of deeper critical thinking and push past that info dump.
Yeah, based on the insights that we uncovered during our research, we wondered whether or not if role play is merely just a vehicle to achieving the deeper, more engaging discussions. I mean, that is what we were measuring and looking for in our study. But when we stepped back and took another look at our results and findings, we determined that what makes a good discussion for student engagement and critical thinking could be universal. And with that, one recommendation we have is to provide detailed instructions and clear expectations so students know how to approach that discussion assignment. Now, I know that this isn't anything new, and in online learning, we always talk about the need for having clear expectations, but this is more of the evidence to explain that why. And we recommend that the instructions should be about 90 to 95% complete and standalone of what students are to do. Then the facilitator can come in and help guide that discussion and make it go from good to even outstanding. And in synchronous discussions, the instructor is able to probe further to ask that student questions. But how do we do that in asynchronous? And our suggestion is to ask students to share their thought process for all to see, sort of a think aloud process, if you will. And this prompting invites deeper discussion instead of just synthesizing their thoughts or materials. And this will help to avoid that information dump that Kristin was just describing. And another recommendation is to have students to pose questions in their posts to invite more discussions with peers. An example might be, I wonder what others might think about. And having such questions may automatically invite students to think and engage with each other. And we also recommend that to have students to weave in their researched or found evidence into the body of the discussion instead of just making generalizations and posting a link down at the bottom of the post. And as we reviewed the transcripts, we often wondered whether or not students were really integrating their found sources. We found some students simply posted a link down at the bottom of their discussion without referencing to even what it was about. And we wondered if it was even in alignment with the discussion itself. And as an instructor, perhaps think about how important it is to have students to incorporate that knowledge into their post rather than providing a link and hoping that someone will be able to go out and look it up themselves. And lastly, as Kristin mentioned, we recommend having including a reflection at the end of the discussion post. And that's where our strongest evidence of knowledge construction, that strong indicator of critical thinking and engagement, was found. And we know that this will take more time, but it is helpful for students to be able to synthesize not only their own thoughts, but the thoughts that they gain from others.
So Laurie just shared some recommendations, and I'm really quickly, before we come back together, to show some quick draft changes that say we were in a design session with a faculty collaborator. So I'll communicate the general ideas. You don't have to read the text, that's less important. So for detailed instructions, if I were working with faculty, we might talk about getting more detailed about the goal of the discussion with a purpose section. Why are we doing this? What skills are we practicing? How do we approach this? A little scaffolding there. And then at the bottom, I might propose adding a section that's more transparent about critical thinking. Okay, I'm looking for this. How do we show evidence of that, especially in their first couple of discussions? And then with the next recommendation, we might directly ask students to share their thought process. As outside researchers, we saw students almost get to that point of showing evidence. We'd be sitting there looking at the transcripts and going, oh, I want to know a little bit more about what they're thinking, but the discussion's over, I'm not there. So putting that right there in the instructions, share your thought process. I've started doing this recently, so I'm going to see how that goes. Asking questions, and again, just reminding students they can ask each other questions. That was really rare when we looked at these transcripts. It was almost like gold to see a student go, well, I'm not so sure about this, but what does somebody else think about this? So reminding them they can do that. And weaving in research evidence, again, I just spelled that out. It's better used to support an opinion or solution or goal discussion. If the goal of the discussion is to think critically. So if you've got evidence, weave it in there, just dump it in at the bottom, because it's hard to tell. So that was just kind of almost like a role play of me as designer coming in saying, okay, well, we want to push this discussion further. We want to spend the time on that. These are some changes we might make. And as an addendum to that, we had a colleague do that with one of his faculty. So this is out there in the wild somewhere, kind of following those guidelines. So I can't wait to hear how this discussion goes. So I just wanted to show, all right, well, we're trying these things. So that's our next step, maybe measuring those. All right. I'm going to hand it back over to Laurie to get it back together.
Yeah, during our time together, Kristin and I shared our research findings and recommendations for how to be able to increase student engagement, think critically, construct knowledge, even broaden student viewpoints in online discussions. And before we turn it over to open discussion and Q&A, I just wanted to pause a moment to allow you to collect your thoughts and reflect maybe even on your own use of online discussions or your recommendations. And I've written 2 questions on the slide as a guide. And again, I'm just going to pause for just a few moments and then come back and for us to kind of share reflections or a chance to ask any questions that you have of us in our research.
And I just got a moment to pop over the chat, and I saw Karen liked our pictures. So we put a lot of thought into those. Thank you.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen. And again, we just wanted to pause and reflect on the use of online discussions and what it might mean for how to, what are the best ingredients or key ingredients to making them be more engaging. And, a lot of times we think we need to have the face-to-face discussion in order to make it engaging, but this is just ways to turn sort of the asynchronous discussion into that opportunity. And so let's just open it up and have a discussion about any questions that you might have on the research that we have of ourselves, or any themes or ideas that sort of came to mind as we were sharing our research. And so just kind of open it up for a large group discussion here.
Well, my first question is, will you share your PowerPoint with me? Is that on the site? Is it posted on the site, Aisha?
Kristin, can you advance the slide?
Yes.
And I'm not sure, I didn't see a place for where to upload slides, but we can definitely, if you want to email us directly, Becky, or
okay.
We were just kind of figuring out how to best do that. But we also have a white paper that we've written that we have, and we also have our other, what we called our recipe cards, our discussion twists that we had shared out as recommendations for ways to sort of move beyond that traditional discussion of the read, eliciting that read, write, post pattern. So we can definitely share those. And Kristin, I'm not sure if you want to pop that link in the.
Yeah, I've got the twist cards recipe.
Yeah, awesome.
The recipe cards. The white paper is pretty much what we talked about today, without the fun visuals.
Great.
So
I'll email you guys.
But definitely email us. We'll put our email in the. I'll just put email in the chat to get the slides for the presentation.
And I put on my screen, if this is the twist recipe card. So it's just all 8 ideas for kind of reinvigorating your discussions with what it is, and then tips for how to do it. If there's any one of these, by the way, that you look at and say, oh, I want to try that, but I need more information, because these are pretty short, just meant to generate ideas. Just contact us, let us know. We can give you some info on that.
Definitely.
Yes, if you could share discussion post ideas, because I think, I work with faculty too, and they have most difficulty with, that might be a good idea, but how much direction do you give them and things like that. So if you had some examples of discussion posts as well, do you have those as well?
Do you mean the student discussion posts, or do you mean the instructions for what to provide?
the instructions to what to put in the, directions. So it's really specific. So you had one up a minute ago that showed a few slides back. You had a good example.
I was gonna say, if you could
Oh.
show that up again, Kristin.
Yeah.
So like Kyle's one.
Either Kyle's or even just our own
Our
example
own.
too.
Yeah.
Yes, those examples. I think when they see examples like that, it's very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Karen, if you want to email us, again, this is in our slide deck if you want, and then you can kind of have it as a reference too. We can definitely provide that. But yeah, we're just trying to say, provide the detailed instructions of as much detail around the instructions of what you want, if how you want to sort of frame the instructions around it. I think it would be helpful because, right, if we want to elicit student engagement, we need to kind of, what are we asking students to do? So we have to sort of set them up for success in there. And Kristin, if you could bump up to like a couple of slides up where it's got the green little box on the bottom. I don't know.
Oh. Like these.
I'm just gonna say slide 48.
Oh, that works super well.
So
Nothing like specificity.
So just kind of like framing about, what it is that we want from you, post an example, think out loud. I think Kristin had put in there at the bottom, criteria for success, sharing your thought process in doing the activity. We found, like I think Kristin had mentioned when we were reviewing the transcript, that really made us find that we wanted to know more. We wanted to dig into the students' sort of cognitive processing instead of going, here's my final answer, but we wanted to really see sort of that metacognition of how do they get to that thought process. And I think that's where you can kind of literally on paper see the students thinking about it. And to me, it also allowed for other students to kind of engage with that person to say, I was thinking the same thing. I wasn't sure if it was it was just because of the role I was assigned, or if it was just my initial coming into the conversation. But it was always interesting. Those types of think alouds were almost more inviting for discussion with each other. And so just kind of allowing one to kind of see not only their own thought process as an instructor, but to see students engaging with each other about just kind of their own thought process too.
Thank you.
Does that help answer your question, Karen?
Yes, I like the criteria for success because I see a lot of, part 1, part 2. Maybe they'll have a rubric, maybe they won't, but they don't have that criteria for success, which I think is really useful.
No. And there's a framework too that's really easy to follow called the TILT framework. That could also be really useful in crafting any kind of assignment. And it's all about having that purpose and then having that criteria. It's just about transparency. And that's the biggest theme, is just total transparency. So that's a good framework to check out too, for a guide on how to write instructions.
Do you remember, Kristin, what it stands for?
A transparency, something. I'm really bad with acronyms, so don't roast me on this.
Not a quiz.
Does anybody know? TILT, T-I-L-T. Transparency is one of them.
But
right, just how long it took you to do the analysis. I'm sorry, the analysis section, like especially qualitative. How long did it take you guys to get all that?
Well, the whole process took probably a little bit longer since it wasn't our main focus of our job. But I want to say from initial, just the two of us separately evaluating the transcripts and marking the models with the transcripts, I think to getting to the final analysis with the results, I think that probably took us about 6 months. And again, it wasn't full-time work, but I think if we were to have spent full time on it, it probably would have taken us maybe a couple of months, I'll say, because we wanted to, again, we wanted to just kind of discuss any discrepancies in the markings that we found, so that if we only agreed maybe 40% on this particular transcript, we wanted to verify that we were true to our marking, or if we needed to make any adjustments on that. But then once we had all the markings, and then we just kind of looked for, like we said, kind of the repeated qualitative words and phrases. That was interesting because we took I will give Kristin the credit, very detailed notes about what some of our insights and findings were, and we kind of called out and highlighted some of those particular words. So when we actually went to do the qualitative coding, that really stood out easily to us. But a lot of it was just kind of looking at the transcripts using those two particular models, and just kind of really being detailed about, does it or does it not, fit within this indicator or criteria. And that, because, it's essentially a rubric, and it's like, it's very subjective, right? Subjective. And so you're like, I think it does. And so that part took a little bit longer, just to make sure that we were indeed marking it and agreeing in our markings that we had.
It didn't take that long individually doing it, but it was coming back together and looking at each individual one, because we really wanted to look at areas where one of us said where the agreement was so off. So that's what took the longest amount of time, just getting together and just discussing this, because it really also opened my eyes to just how subjective it could be, how I could see something. A lot of times the phrase, but I think there's something there. And then we would talk about that something that was there as far as critical thinking or student engagement. So it was really fascinating just reading through the transcripts.
And it was during those discussions and conversations that we really sort of came up with those recommendations that we had at the end to say, is it just for role play, or is it universal that this could be applied to anybody? And so it was really sort of in that moment, in that data analysis that we said, I think this could be, for any discussion, and not just this particular one. So that's why we wanted to have some real takeaways. If you're not just using role play, but how do you set up for success and engagement, and not just, I think sometimes, at least me personally, the community of inquiry model, where we have student to student engagement, student to instructor, and student to content, we mostly focus on the student to student. We sometimes fail to look as heavily on the student to content of engaging with the content. And our study really takes a look at, since it's asynchronous, it's self-paced, how do students really reach in and grasp that content, and from there, then start to do the student to student connection as well. So we really heavily took a look at cognitive engagement instead of just student to student. And within cognitive, also some of the behavioral engagement that came out too, like I never really thought about this before, and kind of seeing some of that transformation, because they're thinking out loud, but just to really see that transformative thinking process, I think was really interesting as well.
So I'm an instructional designer. I don't think we talked about that at the beginning, but I design faculty training. And Karen, it sounds like you also do some faculty training. So
Yes, I
have
do.
to wonder. Yeah, right. I wonder if, because you were putting together a role play discussion, the novelty of that made your directions more specific. And I think that is the universal part, is that when you really make the expectations clear, students are so much more likely to be successful because they're not trying to guess what you want. And these are, like this is, very detailed instructions, which is, what you want to see. So
Right.
it's just, I'm just really interesting. So I'm so excited that I randomly got assigned to host this session.
Thank you for saying that, Becky. That's really exciting to hear. And when you say that if role play is just sort of like the setup to get into this space, I will say yes, and sometimes no, because some of the instructions might just be you're given this assigned role, go out, look it up,
Right.
tell me about it, without really giving too many parameters. So I've seen it in that realm. But you're right, if we want to, maybe our promptings were a little bit more framed out of what to do and what to expect. And this is a type of strategy versus just the open-ended discussion prompts where you're saying, pick, let's say 2 of the 5 prompts below and respond, or pick one and respond. And that's open-ended to prompt discussion, but it's not really, I'm going to say, guided in a sense where you're showing, okay, this is sort of the box to some extent of what I want to work within. And so maybe I'm just kind of thinking out loud. I apologize if I'm rambling, but maybe, like you said, having this sort of a specific way to do it just automatically brings more structure to it than maybe otherwise. Although, Kristin, I will say, if you go up to our colleagues' examples, those I believe are just open-ended discussion prompts, but by putting in that essentially the criteria for success, putting that into the instructions itself might just be enough to kind of to frame it out there too.
You put those in as like tips, right? Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Are those also in a rubric of some sort too, or is the criteria separate from a rubric?
That I am not aware of. I don't
I'm
know
not sure.
what he
Yeah,
has.
because a lot of times we've got criteria, but then our rubric measures how well we perform in meeting those criteria. So I'm not sure. This was when he had just drafted it up, so I could check on that. But normally, I almost feel like that's the easiest way to do things. Is we've got, because I was working with an instructor recently, and we had a list of criteria, and it was like an amount of points per criteria. And we talked about, instead of like trying to pick how many points, how about we do our performance, which is like, what is our exemplary performance of those, and how do we measure that? So those, we separate those things. That's how I prefer to do it. And a lot of times what I'll recommend is to have that rubric, and the criteria is what were included, but the rubric is, well, how did I do on that?
All right, well, I think we may have 20 more seconds or so. Are there any additional questions or comments for Kristin and Laurie?
Just, do you plan to do research on some of the other ones? Because you said you only selected one. So were you going to continue this research for some of the other strategies?
I don't know, speak for both. I think we just talked about this. We're working on another project right now where we're spending our time coming up with like a library of examples of instructional strategies. So not just discussions. So the research was fun. It was really time consuming. So we want to work on something that can be used directly in our work in designing courses. But it would be fun, but we don't have any plans to. I don't think so, unless you've changed your mind.
Not immediate, but I know we've been asked this question a few times, and so I almost feel bad saying no, because we both have been very passionate about getting this far. And I know initially, before starting true into the research, we said it would be fun when we're done, especially since we've gone through the process. We're familiar with the process and what to look for, to pick another strategy. One of the 8 that we've use and just kind of really take a deep dive into that too. So I know it might not be immediate, it might not be like starting in January, but I still think that we should do that, Kristin. It wouldn't hurt.
Yeah, it would be fun. And then also we got a question today, which is what can we see examples then of the prompts? And that's kind of like where we're going more, is like getting more examples out there, like on a website. So that's kind of our next thing. I would love, it is. Does anybody here like doing research? Yeah. Becky?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I just finished a major qualitative research. I think it takes like a year or two till you want to do another, because it's so time
Well,
consuming.
yeah.
That's exactly
That's fair.
how, like, we have the warm fuzzy feelings but we need a break, a little break.
Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. I just want to say you guys are so lucky. So I work alone. I'm not alone, but I'm the only instructional designer within like 3 levels of what I do. I can tell you guys have so much fun together, and that is just the coolest. So enjoy it. That's amazing.
Thank you for that.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, that means a lot.
I'm glad this connection has come through too in the work that we've done and shared with you today. So yeah, definitely. I told Kristin, well, it's been a couple of years since we started the project in 2018 just with discussions and doing that. And so we've been together that long, that intimate and working together, and I said, well, if there's more, you're still with me. So go from
And
there.
this is like,
Right.
and if anybody ever wants to just chat and get some new perspectives or have coffee or what, yeah. Love
Awesome.
networking outside of
Well, you may hear from me
conferences and stuff.
soon.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Laurie and Kristin, for your presentation, and thank you all for attending this session. I'd like to remind you all about the asynchronous activities that are listed in the conference program. And I hope that you all enjoy the rest of the ADEO conference. Thank you again.